June 28, 1986, Mexico City. Carlos Mendez had been Maradona's shadow for 8 months, the man Diego trusted with his life. That's exactly why the Camorra paid him $100,000 to step aside. 3 hours before the World Cup final, Carlos opened the hotel room door. 3 men with sledgehammers walked past him toward Diego's bed. Carlos had one choice: let them destroy the greatest footballer alive, or betray the deadliest crime family in Italy. What Carlos did in the next 10 minutes changed football history. The Camorra put a price on his head that still stands today. And for 37 years, when people celebrated Argentina's World Cup victory, they never knew how close it came to never happening. The night Carlos chose between blood money and brotherhood. The night one man's conscience saved a nation's dreams. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hotel corridor stretched like a tomb, fluorescent lights flickering against burgundy wallpaper that had seen better decades. Carlos's hand trembled as he gripped the door handle, the metal slick with his sweat. Behind him, the 3 men waited with the patience of vultures, sledgehammers hanging loose at their sides, faces carved from Neapolitan stone. "You sure about this, hermano?" whispered Salvatore Grimaldi, the tallest of the 3. His breath reeked of cigarettes and garlic. "Once we walk through that door, there's no going back for any of us." Carlos's throat felt packed with sand. Through the thin walls, he could hear Diego's television murmuring highlights from Argentina's semi-final victory. The same voice that had laughed with him over mate just hours earlier, planning what they'd do after tomorrow's final against West Germany. Diego trusted him completely, had called him mi hermano del alma, brother of my soul. The envelope in Carlos's jacket pocket felt heavier than lead. 100,000 American dollars. More money than his father had seen in a lifetime of breaking his back in the shipyards of La Boca. More than enough to get his sister Maria the cancer treatment she needed. The treatment that would save her life. "He's probably asleep," Carlos whispered back, his voice barely audible. "Room 412, just like we discussed." But even as he spoke the words, Carlos knew Diego wouldn't be sleeping. The kid never slept before big games. Too much electricity in his veins, too much fire in his belly. He'd be lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, visualizing every touch, every pass, every moment of tomorrow's match, dreaming of lifting the golden trophy above his head. Grimaldi's hand found Carlos's shoulder, fingers digging into muscle. "The Don wants this clean. Quick. Break the ankles, maybe a kneecap. Nothing fatal. Just enough to keep him out of the final." Carlos nodded, though his stomach lurched. He'd seen what sledgehammers could do to bone. Had watched Grimaldi work before, back in Naples, when the Camorra needed to send messages. The sounds haunted him still, the wet crack, the screaming that followed. "And you're certain he'll be alone?" asked Rocco, the shortest of the 3. His eyes were black holes in a face scarred by childhood smallpox. "Room service at 9. I sent the others away for the evening, told them I could handle security alone." The lie tasted like ash on his tongue. Through the door, Carlos heard Diego laugh at something on television, that same infectious laugh that had charmed reporters, teammates, and an entire nation. The laugh of a 25-year-old kid from the slums who'd carried Argentina's hopes on his shoulders for 3 weeks. Carlos thought of Maria lying in the charity ward of Hospital Italiano, her face gray as November sky. The doctors had given her 6 months without treatment. The Camorra money would buy her the best care in Buenos Aires, maybe even send her to specialists in America, but it would cost Diego everything. "Let's move," Grimaldi muttered, checking his watch. "The longer we wait, the more chance someone comes back." Carlos turned the handle. The lock clicked open with a sound like breaking glass. The room beyond was bathed in blue television light. Diego sat cross-legged on the bed, wearing only shorts and an Argentina jersey, his dark curls falling across his forehead as he watched footage of West Germany's training session. He looked up as the door opened, a smile spreading across his face. "Carlos, hermano, come sit. Look at these German robots. They have no soul, no passion. Tomorrow we show them what real football looks like." Behind Carlos, the 3 men tensed like coiled springs. Grimaldi's hand shifted grip on his sledgehammer. Diego's eyes moved past Carlos to the shadows in the doorway. The smile faltered. Who? Diego, Carlos said quietly, his voice steady despite the earthquake in his chest. Get up. Slowly. Something in his tone made Diego's expression change. The boyish excitement vanished, replaced by the street-smart wariness of someone who'd grown up in Villa Fiorito, where danger wore 1,000 faces. Carlos, what's happening? Get up, Carlos repeated. Move to the window. Grimaldi stepped into the light, the sledgehammer now visible. Rocco and the third man followed, spreading out like wolves surrounding prey. Diego's face went white. Madre de Dios. Nothing personal, kid, Grimaldi said in accented Spanish. Just business. The television continued its cheerful commentary about tomorrow's final, the match that might never happen, the dream that hung by a thread in a Mexico City hotel room. Carlos felt time crystallizing around him like ice. In seconds, he would have to choose, his sister's life or his brother's legs, blood money or brotherhood, the Comoras' gold or Argentina's gold. Behind him, Grimaldi raised the sledgehammer. What happened next would echo through football history and haunt Carlos Mendez for the rest of his days. Time fractured into heartbeats. Carlos could hear his pulse hammering against his eardrums, drowning out the television's cheerful commentary about West Germany's defensive strategies. The hotel room felt impossibly small, the air thick with menace and the lingering scent of Diego's cologne, Agua Brava, the same cheap brand Carlos himself wore. Diego's bare feet found the carpet with cat-like silence, his body already shifting into the defensive crouch that had served him so well on the pitch. Those famous legs, worth millions to Argentina, to FIFA, to the entire football world, tensed beneath sun-darkened skin. Carlos found himself staring at Diego's ankles, imagining the sound of Grimaldi's sledgehammer against bone. Por favor, Diego whispered, his voice barely audible above the television. Carlos, these men... Don't speak, Carlos cut him off, though his own voice cracked like a teenager's. Behind him, he could hear Rocco's breathing, shallow and excited. The scarred man always got aroused before violence. It was one of many things about the Neapolitans that made Carlos's skin crawl. The third man, Giuseppe, Carlos remembered now, had moved to block the bathroom door. No escape routes. They'd planned this meticulously, down to the last detail. Carlos had provided the blueprint, Diego's routines, his room number, the timing of his evening snack, every piece of information the Camorra needed to destroy Argentina's dreams. Grimaldi stepped closer, his leather shoes silent on the carpet. He'd removed his jacket somewhere in the hallway, revealing massive forearms covered in tattoos that told the story of his crimes. A teardrop below his left eye for the policeman he'd killed in Palermo. Barbed wire around his bicep for his years in prison. And on his knuckles, barely visible in the blue television light, MORTE. Death. You know why we're here, Campione, Grimaldi said, testing the weight of his sledgehammer. The tool was industrial grade, meant for breaking concrete. Nothing personal, just business that couldn't wait until after your little game. Diego's eyes found Carlos in the dim light. The trust there was absolute, unshakable. It was the same look he'd given Carlos that first day in Naples, when they'd met outside the San Paulo Stadium and Diego had said, "They tell me you're the best, that you'd take a bullet for the right person." Carlos had laughed and replied, "Maybe, for the right price." But that had been before he'd gotten to know the kid, before late-night conversations over wine and stories about growing up poor, before Diego had shown him photos of his parents' house in Buenos Aires, the modest place he'd bought with his first professional contract, pulling his family out of Villa Fiorito's muddy streets, before Carlos had started thinking of Diego not as a client, but as the little brother he'd never had. The envelope in his jacket seemed to pulse with heat, $100,000 American. More money than Carlos had ever seen, enough to save Maria's life and maybe have some left over, enough to disappear, start fresh somewhere far from the Camorra's reach. But as he watched Diego's fingers curl into fists, Carlos remembered another envelope, the one that had arrived at his apartment in Naples 3 weeks ago, containing photos of Maria in her hospital bed, and a simple message, "Your sister needs help, we can provide it. All we need is information about the boy's schedule." They hadn't asked him to hurt Diego directly, just to provide intelligence, to be their inside man. They'd made it sound almost innocent. Carlos had told himself it was just information. that someone else would make the hard choices. But standing here now, watching Grimaldi's muscles tense for the first swing, Carlos understood that he'd been lying to himself. The Camorra's money had always come with blood attached. "Carlos," Diego said again, softer now. "¿Qué está pasando, hermano?" The question hit Carlos like a physical blow. "What's happening, brother?" Such simple words, but they contained everything. Trust, confusion, and a desperate hope that his friend would explain why 3 men with weapons had invaded his sanctuary on the eve of the most important match of his life. On the television, a German striker scored a practice goal, and the announcer's voice rose with artificial excitement. Carlos found himself focusing on irrelevant details: the way the curtains moved slightly in the air conditioning's breeze, the red numerals on Diego's bedside clock reading 9:17, the faint sound of mariachi music drifting up from the street below. Mexico City. He was 3,700 miles from Buenos Aires, from Maria's hospital bed, from everything he'd ever called home, and in a few seconds he would either save his sister's life or preserve Diego's career. There was no option that saved them both. Grimaldi raised the sledgehammer higher, his scarred face splitting into a grin. "Last chance to move away, Guardia," he told Carlos. "Unless you want to watch up close." Carlos stepped sideways, not away from Diego, but directly between his friend and the sledgehammer. The movement was instinctive, muscle memory from a dozen street fights in La Boca, but it sent shockwaves through the room. "What the fuck are you doing?" Grimaldi hissed, the hammer frozen mid-swing. Carlos's hand moved to his jacket, not for the envelope of blood money, but for the .38 snub-nose he kept in his shoulder holster. The metal was warm against his palm, familiar as an old lover's touch. Behind him, he heard Diego's sharp intake of breath. "Change of plans," Carlos said quietly. The words surprised him. He hadn't planned to say them, hadn't consciously made the choice, but watching Grimaldi's scarred face contort with rage, Carlos felt something snap inside his chest, not breaking, but clicking into place like a puzzle piece he'd been carrying for years without knowing where it belonged. "You signed a contract, Porco," Rocco spat from near the door, "with Don Castellano himself. You think you can just—" "I think," Carlos interrupted, drawing the pistol in one smooth motion, "that you 3 are going to walk out of here, now." The gun changed everything. Giuseppe's hand moved toward his own weapon, but Carlos was faster, the .38's barrel swinging toward him with predatory precision. 20 years of close protection work had taught Carlos to read violence before it bloomed, the subtle shift in stance, the telltale flutter of eyes before a man committed to attack. "Easy, amico," Grimaldi said, though his voice carried no friendship. "Think about your sister. Think about what happens to her when we tell the Don you betrayed him." The words hit Carlos like ice water. Maria. Sweet Maria with her gentle laugh and her books of poetry, wasting away in a charity ward bed. The cancer was spreading through her lymph nodes like spilled ink, and every day of delay meant less chance the treatment would work. Carlos's gun hand trembled almost imperceptibly. "That's right," Grimaldi continued, sensing weakness. "You kill us, you kill her too. The Don's reach extends far beyond Naples, far beyond Mexico City, all the way to Buenos Aires, all the way to Hospital Italiano, Ward 7, Bed 12. The specificity of the threat made Carlos's stomach lurch. They knew exactly where Maria lay dying. Probably had someone watching her right now. But Diego's voice cut through the fear like a blade. "Carlos, hermano, whatever they're holding over you will find another way." The trust in those words was absolute. Diego didn't even know what Carlos was being threatened with, but he believed, with the same innocent faith that made him think he could dribble past entire teams, that there was always another solution, always a way through. That faith broke something in Carlos. Or maybe it fixed something that had been broken for years. "Your sister's dead anyway," Carlos said to Grimaldi, his voice steady now. "Even if I let you cripple him, even if I take your money. The Don doesn't leave witnesses, and I know too much." "You're wrong." Rocco murdered the last bodyguard who did a job like this. Put a bullet in his head 3 weeks after payment. Made it look like a robbery. Carlos kept his gun trained on Giuseppe while he spoke, but his peripheral vision tracked all 3 men. "I was there, Stronzo. I watched you do it." Grimaldi's face went pale. The sledgehammer wavered in his grip. "So here's what's going to happen," Carlos continued. "You're going to walk out that door. You're going to tell the Don that you never found us, that we'd already left for a different hotel. He'll never believe. He'll believe it because the alternative is explaining to him why 3 of his best men couldn't handle one washed-up bodyguard and a footballer." Carlos's smile held no warmth. "How do you think that conversation goes, Salvatore?" For long seconds, the only sound was the television's mindless chatter about corner kick statistics and weather forecasts for tomorrow's final. Carlos could smell his own sweat, could taste copper fear on his tongue. The gun felt impossibly heavy in his hand. Then, Grimaldi slowly lowered the sledgehammer. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "You know that, right? This is just the beginning." "I know." The 3 men filed out like shadows, Rocco shooting one last venomous look over his shoulder before the door clicked shut. Carlos kept the gun raised until their footsteps faded down the corridor, then sank onto Diego's bed as his legs gave out. "Dios mío," Diego whispered. "Carlos, what have you done?" Carlos stared at the pistol in his hands, already knowing the answer. He'd just signed his own death warrant. And Maria's too, most likely. The Camora's memory was long, their reach infinite. But watching Diego's face in the blue television light, alive, whole, ready for tomorrow's final, Carlos found he couldn't regret the choice. Not yet, anyway. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the television's drone and the distant hum of Mexico City traffic. Carlos holstered his pistol with shaking hands, the metal suddenly foreign against his ribs. The room felt different now, smaller, contaminated by what had almost happened. Diego remained frozen by the window, his famous legs still coiled for flight. Those same legs that would carry Argentina's hopes tomorrow, that Grimaldi's sledgehammer had been meant to shatter. In the blue television glow, Carlos could see the questions building behind Diego's eyes like storm clouds. "Hermano," Diego said finally, his voice careful. "Who were those men?" Carlos stood slowly, his knees protesting. 58 years old, and feeling every day of it. Nobody. Street criminals. They must have heard about the final. Thought they could. Mentira. The word cut through Carlos's lie like a blade. "Bullshit, Carlos. They knew your name. They spoke Italian." The kid was too smart. Had always been too smart, picking up languages and reading situations with the same intuition that made him untouchable on the pitch. Carlos moved to the window, peering through the curtain at the street below. No black sedans, no watchers in doorways. Yet, "It's complicated," Carlos said. Then uncomplicated. Diego's voice carried an edge Carlos had never heard before. Not anger, but something harder. The tone of someone who'd grown up in Villa Fiorito, where survival meant recognizing danger in all its forms. Carlos's phone rang before he could answer. The sound made them both jump. He glanced at the display, unknown number. His blood turned to ice water. "Sí. Buonasera, Carlos." The voice was silk over steel. Refined Naples aristocracy with undertones of violence. Don Castellano himself. "I trust our mutual friends delivered their message clearly." Carlos felt Diego's eyes boring into him, saw the understanding dawn across his friend's face like sunrise. The kid wasn't stupid. 3 Italian men with weapons, followed immediately by a call from someone who spoke like money and death. "I don't know what you're talking about," Carlos said. Laughter, soft as poisoned honey. "Of course not. Perhaps you'd prefer to discuss your sister's condition instead? I understand the doctors are pessimistic." The phone felt slippery in Carlos's grip. Across the room, Diego had gone very still, the way he did before making impossible plays on the field. Reading the situation, calculating angles. Maria has nothing to do with this. Everything has to do with everything, caro amico. Your sister's health, your young friend's upcoming match, the considerable sum we've invested in ensuring certain outcomes. The Don's voice never rose above conversational level, which somehow made it more terrifying. "I'm disappointed in your associates' report. They seemed confused about hotel arrangements." Carlos closed his eyes. The Camora's intelligence network was legendary, built on decades of corruption and fear. They probably knew exactly what had happened in this room within minutes of Grimaldi's departure. Sometimes plans change, Carlos said carefully. Indeed, sometimes they do. A pause, filled with implications. I wonder if your young charge understands the complexity of his situation, the delicate balance required for tomorrow's match to proceed as nature intends. The threat was velvet-wrapped but unmistakable. Carlos looked at Diego, who was watching him with growing comprehension. The kid's hands had closed into fists, not from fear, but from rage. Carlos had seen that expression before, when opposing players tried to intimidate Diego with dirty tackles or whispered insults. It never ended well for them. He understands nothing, Carlos said quickly, and it stays that way. Naturalmente. Though I confess curiosity about your change of heart. Our research suggested you were a practical man, a man who understood family obligations. I am. Then perhaps we can find alternative arrangements. Your sister's treatment need not be delayed. There are many ways to influence a football match, see? A bad meal, perhaps. Food poisoning strikes so suddenly, so unpredictably. Carlos's free hand moved unconsciously toward his gun. The Don was offering him another chance. Poison Diego instead of breaking his legs. Probably something subtle, designed to look like accident or bad luck. The kind of thing that happened to athletes under pressure. I'll think about it, Carlos lied. Bene. You have until midnight. After that, the line went quiet for several seconds. After that, we explore less pleasant alternatives. For everyone involved, the connection died. Carlos set the phone down with exaggerated care as if it might explode. Diego moved closer, his bare feet silent on the carpet. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but Carlos caught the tremor underneath. Not fear, but fury held in check. Carlos, tell me everything. Now. Outside their window, Mexico City glittered like scattered diamonds, beautiful and indifferent. Tomorrow, this same city would host the World Cup final. If Diego lived that long, if any of them did.